Well, for an in-depth discussion on the life and times of Robert Mugabe, Arise News analyst Emmanuel Efeni and Rufai Oseni joins me now in the studio, while Arise correspondent Thamzanqa Zhou is standing by in our London studios. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining me at this time. Tham, let me just begin with you. What do we know? What else have we learned since the last time we spoke? World leaders' reaction, any you have for us at this time?
Yeah, Adesuwa, we have seen pictures of what is believed to be the mortuary in Singapore, where the body of former president of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe, is. And the Zimbabwean delegation, remember, President Emmerson Mnangagwa and quite a number of ministers were in Cape Town in South Africa during the World Economic Forum. They have flown back as a group to Zimbabwe to begin preparations. But also, I'm just getting information that probably one of the other senior army officers has passed on in Ethiopia as well. So Zimbabwe could be looking at 2 deaths of people who probably will both be buried at the National Heroes Acre or at least have everything around the issues to do with national heroes. That is what's there. We have seen responses from Africa, Kenya. We heard that in Nairobi there were there was a request for flags to fly at half-mast. They are saying that this is an African hero. We have also seen responses from South Africa and other nations, because the Robert Mugabe that led Zimbabwe was in 2 ways. In his early years, he was close to the West. And then when he fell out with the West, around about the end of the 90s, 98, 97, 98, going to the end of his career, he was then very close to the African Union, and a lot of people in Africa viewed him as a hero who was able to stand up to what was happening in the West. But the latest we have is that as soon as President Mnangagwa is back in Zimbabwe, then there will be announcements in terms of the timetable and what now needs to happen and how they can bring his body from Singapore to Zimbabwe.
Well, Tham, I just spoke to Bode Oshosami in Cape Town moments ago, and we're discussing Robert Mugabe's economic legacies. Well, Bode has the opinion that he wasn't to blame totally for the economic woes of the country. I wonder if you share in Bode's thoughts. I mean, what were the most profound economic challenges that the people had to deal with as he reigned?
Well, there were 3 things, Adesuwa. The first is that in the early 80s, it was during the Cold War, the West needed him because they wanted a number of African leaders who could guard against what was happening in the West. People like Julius Nyerere in Tanzania and others, Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, they had aligned with socialism and the Eastern Bloc. So the West needed someone who was academic like Robert Mugabe. So he then went on to do the economic structural adjustment programs, and that was seen as an effort to get closer to the West and then get funding from the West. But that did not quite work. But when the land reform program came, it was also an effort by local people to own the means of production, to own the land that they said was land that belonged to them, which is what the reason for going to war was. But then sanctions were imposed by both the EU and the United States. And at that point, rich as Zimbabwe might be, it just could not cope with the sanctions, especially given that the bulk of the economy in Zimbabwe was linked to the West at the time. The factories, the mines, the farms, the market was in the West. The financial institutions from Barclays to maybe even Standard Chartered, these were foreign banks based in Zimbabwe, including Stanbic or Standard Bank from South Africa. So the Zimbabwe's economy was squeezed throughout his time. So it's difficult to make a judgment on his economic legacy, because he was almost always facing all these issues throughout that time. Had he lived in a different time, maybe we could have made a different judgment. But there is evidence that in the 90s, economic structural adjustment program failed, and also beyond 2000, once the sanctions were there, everything crumbled around him in Zimbabwe, which ultimately led to his political downfall. And, you know, when you see that speech that he was making there, the last speech, the Asante Sana speech, it encompasses almost everything in that, because I remember that day very well. He was expected to resign on that day, but he made a very long speech and said, "Good night, Asante Sana." That defined who Robert Mugabe is. You could never know or tell what he was going to do the next minute, Adesuwa.
Very unpredictable. Well, hold on, Tham. I'll come back to you. Let me bring in my panel in the studio here into the discussion. Emmanuel Efeni, all you need to do is to look at the headlines across all media this morning, and you can tell the mixed legacies Robert Mugabe has left behind. But regardless of how people saw him, he was a towering figure, not just on the continent, but on the world stage.
Yes, Robert Mugabe, a true African icon. The South African government described him as a fearless Pan-Africanist, liberation fighter. One cannot, no matter how you feel about Robert Mugabe over the years, you cannot take out that fact that he was at the forefront of ending white minority rule in his country. And, but his long stay in power over time also did a lot to stunt multi-party democracy in Zimbabwe. He was one who really clung to power, and but for the military henchmen who worked with him over time, who decided to end his stay in power, he was ready to stay forever until he died, and he made no mistake in saying, in mouthing the fact that he will rule until his 100 years. But if you look at how he also, how he tried to cling on to power, but if only he had given room for multi-party democracy to thrive, perhaps the country would have been a better place today, even when he's gone.
It's a lot to talk about, Rufai. I mean, when the economy faltered, Robert Mugabe lost his nerve. He, set in place this catastrophic land reforms. A lot of people say that was his undoing. But we'll come back to talk more about this and a whole lot more about the life and times of Robert Mugabe. Let's go on a break on Arise Africa, a special edition here covering the life and times of Zimbabwe's former president, Robert Mugabe, who has died far away in Singapore at the age of 95 this morning. Stay tuned, we'll be right back.
They wish our oil was theirs. They wish our diamonds and gold and all we have by way of underground wealth, all that wealth they wish was their own. How can these natives continue to have that? And when they look at their little island, the little British Isles there, naked with nothing to offer, except now the remains of coal, which they are burning every day. And they say, the oil we have is not enough, the fuel we have is not enough to sustain us, not enough diesel. Let us store this, ours. There is loss in Africa. They don't know what to do with it in Africa. We will get it by hook or by crook.
Late Robert Mugabe speaking there, fearless, witty, as usual. My panelists today on the special edition of Arise Africa, Arise News analyst Emmanuel Efeni and Rufai Oseni are with me in the Lagos studios, and Thamzanqa Zhou from our London studios. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with me. Rufai, I was just going to ask you before that break, you know, the violent land grab reforms he referred to as a third Chimurenga. A lot of people said that was his undoing. Zimbabwe never recovered from that era.
I mean, that was his undoing really greatly. And you know that the offshoot of that did have an after effect on the Nigerian economy. In fact, those white Zimbabwean farmers did come to Kwara State in Nigeria at some point after that happened. But it was his undoing, but the way he did it was the problem. I mean, you're supposed to have a conversation on expropriation of land, just like they're about to have in South Africa, you know, with the likes of Julius Malema. But the way he did it, it was too sudden. Obviously, you know, when he came to power, he said it in the capital then in 1980, Salisbury, they were definitely, because Harare was called Salisbury then, so we're definitely going to talk about land. And it has to be said. The white farmers still wanted to keep their land. But as time went on, the conversation was had. But how it did it was a problem. And it was so fast, it was so sudden, that made Zimbabwe the breadbasket of Southern Africa, it was called, plunge in food production and the likes. Also, you talked about the economy. I mean, the sanctions started kicking in. The West started fighting it pretty much around the 98-99 period. And the next thing he did was to increase the problem by going to print more money. That was the first of its kind on the African soil. And when Mugabe started, he doesn't stop. He went overdrive, constantly printing money. The Zimbabwean dollars became worthless. As it is today, there's no national currency in Zimbabwe. They keep trying all sorts of palliative measures. At some point, British pound sterling, American dollars were spent on the streets of Zimbabwe. And at some point, the inflation rate was of biblical proportion. It reached about 1,000,000%. In fact, it was said in Zimbabwe that if you go into a store in Zimbabwe, you buy bread, and you say, okay, the bread is sold for you for 5 Zimbabwean dollar. Maybe before you pull out your money and pay for the bread will have increased to about 20 Zimbabwean dollar. That's to show you the threshold of the inflation that hit the country because of those policies. But by and large, I mean, the West too were also cooperating in this. It wasn't only Robert Mugabe. The grabbing of land, the British were not happy about it. And multilateral agencies around the world, they pushed policies against him, and the economy was crippled. And that's why you see a lot of Zimbabweans in South Africa today.
Let me bring back Tham into this conversation. The international aid also ceased at that time when, you know, the West was appalled at what was going on in Zimbabwe. How would you describe his effort at trying to reform the economy and, you know, the impact it had on the people?
Well, Adesuwa, let me probably begin here and say that there's a misconception, and it's a continuing narrative, thinking that Robert Mugabe initiated and led the land redistribution exercise that we saw in the year 2000 and going forward. Before then, there had been 17 years where the country was saying there was a war. More than 30,000 people lost their lives during the war to gain independence in Zimbabwe. And after that, people said the reason they were fighting was to get back their land, their mines, their factories, everything that was Zimbabwean to be in the hands of Zimbabweans rather than in the hands of those that had benefited from the colonial system. But Robert Mugabe was seen as someone very close to the British. He was knighted by the British. Margaret Thatcher was in Zimbabwe. The Chogam was even held in Harare. That's why you hear about the Harare Declaration in the Commonwealth. What you had was the local people pushing Robert Mugabe and say you can't keep protecting white farmers and white people when the locals don't have anything. So it was a local initiative by war veterans, not Robert Mugabe. The government refused to intervene using the military or security forces, which is where the fallout with the Labour government came in, because Claire Short was the Department of International Development Secretary in the UK, and Tony Blair was the Prime Minister, ordered Robert Mugabe to intervene and stop the local people from repossessing the farms. And Robert Mugabe refused at that point. And what the government was now doing is saying, if you say you have taken a farm that belonged to your grandfather, you then can get a letter of offer once you bring that evidence. So that's how, but people keep saying that Robert Mugabe initiated and led this. No, that was not the case. It was his refusal to go in to send the military or the police and the security forces to remove the people that created that problem, and then the sanctions were put in place. The elections were always held in the way that they were. The violence in Zimbabwe, when people talk about Mugabe, is mainly in the 1980s during the Gukurahundi. It was something similar to what was happening in Biafra without anyone fighting the other side. So a lot of civilians died in that particular period. So, and this is what people have been saying all along, that the West did not intervene at the time, did not speak about those human rights abuses at the time, because he was very close to the West. But once the farm issue, the land issue came, then suddenly he was described as the tyrant, the dictator, but he had never changed from 1980 to the time that he actually left power. But you'll find that in Africa, he's celebrated for the work that he did to stand up against the West, but locally, the people in the north of the country were not happy with the economic problems, whatever effort he was doing. Now, when the country was under sanctions, it was always going to be very, very difficult indeed, because almost everything crumbled at that point. But he educated them, the people in the north, and he made sure that they had health care, they had the best in the 80s and the 90s. People in the south will continuously see Robert Mugabe as somebody who was discriminating against them, who committed serious human rights violations and atrocities against civilians. So you continue to have this mixed bag, both locally and internationally.
Thank you, Sam. Hold on, we'll get back to you. Just stand by. Let me bring in Efeni into this conversation, because you seem to have a contrary opinion. Whatever Mugabe did for the people, it was just not enough.
You see, no matter how you garnish the issue of land reform or land grab, you cannot exonerate Robert Mugabe, because before that land grab, Mugabe had been defeated in the constitutional referendum in the February 2000, and which many saw as a rebuff of Mugabe and triumph for the then emerging movement for democratic change. And it was after that defeat, yes, to endorse a constitution which had been drafted a year before. And in that constitutional draft, you had this issue of land expropriation, going back to the original owners, that the government of the day looked the other way for what you can call a lawless takeover of land. You cannot exonerate the government of the day or the president, because it was also seen as a way to shore up his own popularity, which was dwindling and which was reflected in that referendum where he was defeated. So to just garnish it that he knows nothing, or no, I don't think that will also speak well to history of that land issue.
Rufai, you want to add something here?
I really wanted to add something there because, like you said very, very rightly and strongly, it was pretty much because there was a young Morgan Tsvangirai that was already holding sway with the movement of democratic change in Zimbabwe. Prior to that time, you know, you had a government going on with Joshua Nkono, and he'd been able to sidetrack Joshua Nkono in the government. But Morgan Tsvangirai was pushful. In fact, it was said that Morgan Tsvangirai did make affronts and he didn't win the election. Finally, he had a joint government with Morgan Tsvangirai and the NDC. And at that period was the time that Mugabe was looking for sort of like a soft spot sentiment, pretty much what Trump does, you know, to prompt up his base and say, okay, this is it. This is what you want to hear. So the land issue came into being. And when the land issue came into being, he kept on talking about the fact that the war veterans were the ones that pushed him. These were the veterans that fought in the war with him, that were members of the ZANU-PF. But the truth of the matter is, the war veterans didn't save him when the coup was planted against him. When the likes of Chiwenga, the top military officer, pushed him out of government and had to deal with Emerson the Crocodile Mnangagwa against his wife. So it was just a safe spot. But he cannot say he didn't know about the land. In fact, if you watch back the BBC Newsnight interview as at 1980, when he just came into power, and he was asked by John Snow of the BBC and Newsnight, and was asked about the land matter, he said, definitely, we'll talk about land matter. And he has been somebody that he never wanted opposition, hence Gukurahundi, hence other killings. In fact, let's put history where it is. The founding father of Zimbabwe should be the likes of Joshua Nkono. Because in this fight, Joshua Nkono was the oldest. Joshua Nkono was the one that even set up the party, and the likes of Mugabe came to join him afterwards in the party. So let's put history where it is. I mean, let's not, I know there's a Roman injunction that says, let us speak ill of the dead. But let's call Mugabe for what it was. And I think all of this even broke down for him when his wife, Sally Efron, died in '92. Because his wife could still rein him in. There were talks about his wife trying to restore peace. Because even when the unification happened in 1987 between him and Joshua Nkono, it was his wife that forced him that you must reconcile with Joshua Nkono before peace came.
Welcome back to the special edition of Arise Africa, covering the life and times of Robert Mugabe, former president of Zimbabwe, who died in Singapore at the age of 95. I still have with me in the studio Arise News analyst Emmanuel Efeni and Rufai Oseni. Thank you, gentlemen, for staying with us. Yeah, and Tham should be joining us very soon from our London studios once we can connect with him. Before that break, we had this, controversial issue. I guess when it comes to Mugabe, there's a bit of controversy wherever you turn. Tham had, that notion that this was not a Mugabe issue. The issue of the land and the farms existed, and no matter what Mugabe did, it was just not enough for the people, and on the other hand, for the West. But you guys have contrary notion to that.
Yeah. No, just to put it in historical context. Yes, the land originally belonged to the black people. The colonialists came and grabbed the land. Mugabe and other freedom fighters, Joshua Nkomo, fought to end white minority rule. The white farmers were in charge of the land and farming. At a point in 2000, the blacks took over the land to exonerate the government of the day as not knowing anything, is what I seem to quarrel with. Because Mugabe has just lost that referendum. To confirm a constitution, and thus a constitution that was drafted a year earlier, that made provision for the return of the land.
It was rejected
by the people in a referendum, which in itself was seen as a rebuff of Mugabe, and a triumph for the then emerging Movement for Democratic Change, MDC. Yes. So that for the people to now just move over to the land, and the government did not do anything, took over the farm, and you say the government did not know anything about that. Yes, that is what I seem to quarrel with, that you exonerate Mugabe from, because that land grab or land reform, or no matter how you look at it, was a turning point in the economy of Zimbabwe that brought sanctions from abroad,
EU and the US,
and all that to Zimbabwe. So.
Okay, thank you for clearing our perspective. Stay with me, gentlemen. Emmanuel Efeni and Rufai, thank you for staying with me. We're about to get Tham online as well. But Rufai, let me ask you, Mugabe was deposed in 2017. He had, before then, he had this strained relationship with his party. And then he fired his then vice president, who is now current president, Emmerson Mnangagwa. Do you think that he still had the sway on politics and on his people? Now we are having this conversation on the continent about strong men versus strong institution, but this was the hero of liberation for Zimbabwe. It was very easy for him to transit from that strong, man, and remain so without having the strong institution.
I think, truth to tell, the truth of the matter is, as at that time that he was deposed, he didn't have the sway of the party any longer. I mean, even the War Veterans Association, a very prominent part of the ZANU-PF, were not there with him any longer. It was his wife, Gushi Grace, his wife, Grace Mugabe, that was pretty much, orchestrating everything. So it was pretty much a power tussle. I think he had lost touch. And once he was deposed, a lot of Zimbabweans were ready to come back home and to build their country. I mean, I think I was flying out of Gatwick the 1st December, and I met a lady that said she was coming back to Zimbabwe for the first time in 25 years from the UK because Mugabe is no longer in Zimbabwe. That was in 2017. So I think he had lost touch pretty much. I think his time was long overdue. I think he could have taken a point of view or a cue from Nelson Mugabe, which incidentally they both went to the same University of Fort Hare in South Africa. I think he should have left when the vision was loudest, but he didn't do that.
He didn't do that. Tham is now with us from our London studio. Tham, as we round off here, I was talking about the strained relationship that Mugabe had with his party, his vice president. Tell us about the opposition, though, because it seemed he had some charming relationship with Nelson Chamisa.
Well, in the last days, Robert Mugabe supported the opposition, in particular, simply because he wanted to avoid Emmerson Mnangagwa becoming president, because he had fallen out with the party at that point, and he was not happy in the manner that he was taken out of power. And also, he had tried very hard in his last speech and last days to leave a united ZANU-PF. He didn't believe that having the G40 group and the group that was under Emmerson Mnangagwa and Joyce Mujuru groups, the three of them separate was going to help his party. When he failed, he then supported the opposition. But after the results of the election, he turned and endorsed the presidency of Emmerson Mnangagwa, was given his pensions, and also all these medical bills were being paid for by the state, which explains what all this movement back in Zimbabwe is all about. But also, I think, let me just emphasize to our viewers to make sure that people are not misunderstood. I said earlier, it was not Robert Mugabe policy to take the land in the manner it was taken in 1997, 98, 2000. This started in 1997 when Chenjerai Hunzwi and the war veterans declared that they were going to remove Robert Mugabe from power. It was never his policy, and he did not lead the land repossessions that we saw. This is a point, I think, that I just want your viewers to understand. Much can be said about how he responded afterwards, but it was not his policy, it was not his initiative. He preferred what you call the willing buyer, willing seller, and going through the constitution to try and repossess that land. But that didn't work, and the local people took the land themselves.
Well, a gifted hero who embodied Africa's struggle against colonialism, Robert Mugabe, will be remembered by many people for many different reasons. Thank you so much, Thamzanqa Zhou from our Arise London studios for your input. Emmanuel Efeni, Arise News analyst here in Lagos, thank you so much. And Rufai Oseni. We'll continue to keep an eye on this. He died far away in Singapore, and we'll watch to see what the burial arrangements would be in the coming days. Thank you so much for watching this special edition of Arise Africa on the Arise News channel. I am Adesuwa Omoruan. Goodbye.